episode 1 of the 360 podcast, an all-around look at student-centered education. I'm Laura Gallen.
And I'm Adrian Pumphrey.
And we're excited to bring you a great lineup of guests this season. Tell us about our first one, Adrian.
Well, we're happy to announce that we interviewed the author of Neuroteach, which is all about neuroscience and its implications for teaching and learning. It's authored by Glenn Whitman, who is the director of the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Maryland. So we're very excited to be talking to him today, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
One thing we were wondering, just from one teacher to another, what piqued your interest in neuroscience to start with?
On a personal level, when I got into teaching in independent schools, I knew my content excellently, right? I graduated Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I got a master's from Dartmouth, so I really felt, I know my content. But in reality, one of the, I don't know if it's a good or bad of independent school hiring is that, there's no real prerequisite for us to take any educational classes. So, I came loving history, passionate about history, but there was this gap that I knew of in terms of my exposure to educational theory, behavior psychology, which is still a mainstay of a lot of graduate school or teaching prep programs. And certainly, the cognitive science and neuroscience was nowhere in my own brain. Like every teacher, I work really hard. I mean, I feel I prepare my lessons and my assessments, and I give feedback and the time it deserves. But also, like every teacher, I want that time to yield the most benefit for each of my students. So really around 2007, a sort of a new family to St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Maryland, where we teach, was their son was starting 6th grade, and they were sort of in this space a little from parental interest as well as just, to be honest, as a philanthropic interest. And they were really probably spurred both me and others to say, look, how much do you know about the learning brain? I mean, there's only one educational truth, and anybody can push back on this, but I don't think they can. And we know that every day, every kid will bring his or her brain to every class, right? So I think that's irrefutable, all right? And that might be my snarky New Jersey growing up way to say that. But the great irony that certainly in my own thinking about teaching and learning, and as well as teachers and school leaders around the world who we've worked with as a center, is that roughly only 20% of teachers in a self-reporting survey can claim that they have foundational training or knowledge in how the brain learns. So not only for me, but for educators at Park Tudor and around the world, there is this huge gap of what we know about how the brain learns, works, and thrives. So to me, it really got me excited about being a better teacher and trying to figure out the most complex organ of learning, or to figure out the complex organ of learning that every kid brings to school every day. It didn't take me off the hook of learning my content even better, but I wanted it to stick much longer than my year with each student.
You say 20%. That number seems quite high. I mean, this sort of conversation isn't, one that we normally have in the faculty workroom or whatever.
No, I hope I made it clear that this was a self-reported survey.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I'll let your audience who listens to this podcast or watches this video take that for whatever it's worth. But it's neuroscience, or to be honest, what we think it should be better called mind-brain education science, is not a mainstay or prerequisite for every teacher and school leader to enter a school building. Again, I got to believe this is one of the great ironies in education as we think about closing the teacher quality and student achievement gap, and more importantly, the student well-being and school experience gap. There's this frontier out there that we have thankfully been in a privileged position as a center to be able to work with public and charter and private schools to help close. And the idea that, school in Indiana, Park Tudor, would read a book I co-authored, I mean, that's really exciting for us. And the fact that you guys are having better discussions about this and and hopefully debating and challenging each other around the learning brain. That's a little different than, what should we serve for lunch, our schedule, which does matter and relates and correlates to this work as well.
So, seeing as you were trying to sort of fill your own gap in sort of what you felt that you were an expert in, when you started reading about neuroscience, what did you try in your classroom that made you think, I think I'm onto something. I think I need to keep pursuing this?
Yeah, the one thing I do want to say is, I do want us all to be cautious of throwing the word neuroscience as a standalone around. I mean, in much of the conversation that I believe Neuroteach has probably generated at Park Tudor has probably had little to do with neuroscience, unless you're talking about the architecture of the brain and how the hippocampus and the corpus callosum and myelination and neuron. I got to believe there's a low level of that in your conversation. So, I will just say to the audience out there that most teachers are not using neuroscience in their thinking. The field of mind-brain education science, which Dr. Christina Hinton from Harvard's Graduate School of Education has exposed us to, and Kurt Fisher, is probably a better way to classify this. Now, put that aside. What did I do? Well, I thought that any definition of great teaching meant you gave a lot of homework every night. You gave surprise quizzes for points. That, kids' emotions were left at the door. That wasn't my job as a history teacher. And that really my daily work was I teach, they learn. I mean, that's probably how I approached it. And in reality, that was very short-sighted. I often joke that, and I've written about this a lot lately, that I would like to have a student recall, as Volkswagen recently did by asking for cars to come back. I think I owe most of my students from at least the first 20 years a chance to come back and get and be re-educated for a year. Obviously, none would take it, but the offer stands. What did I stop immediately? I think the most impactful thing for me has been recognizing the connection between emotion and cognition. So to go back to what I haven't given a surprise quiz for points in 5 years, because a lot of I ask teachers when we present, why do you give surprise quizzes? And if they're really honest, most of it's to catch them being bad. Uh-huh. It's to catch kids, right? So even if your best kids, or even if a kid does his or her work, we know a certain percentage of those kids are going to be so freaked out by a 20-point or a 10-point or even a 5-point surprise quiz that their performance is going to be reduced, mostly because of their fight, flight, or flee response from their limbic system. So now, this is not to say I don't, but in actuality, I actually give more formative assessments, low stakes or no stakes assessment, and I make it clear to students why. I mean, I do it because I can get some data where they are, they can get some data where they are, and then together in a low threat or way, we can move forward. So, looking at and believing in emotion and cognition are, I was going to use a history term of peacefully coexist, but I'm not too sure if they actually peacefully coexist. But that's a big one. I also, I've fallen in love, and as a center, we've fallen in love with the work of Dylan William, who, if your audience does not know Dylan Williams' work, put him on your A list, follow him on Twitter. And here's why. I think early on I read a statement that I just didn't believe, but that I bought into, is that students need to work harder than the teacher. Mm-hmm. And I think too often, teachers love their kids, they love their craft, but we're working harder than the kids, and we're working inefficiently. And this led me to really following Dylan's work around feedback. And if you look how I grade, I love writing. I think a value add of attending a private school or any school is to be able to articulate your ideas in the written narrative. Mm-hmm. For public school teachers, this is a lot harder when their class size or overall student population is a lot higher. But, generally, I've never been over 70 students in a school year. But if you've looked how I used to grade writing, it looked like the Battle of Marne happened on it. Like, it was all red, right? I mean, and things were going in different directions. And, I was probably surprised that kids didn't. The quality of jump from the first draft to the final draft was probably not as much, even though I put in a lot of time to get feedback. So if you look at the way I do feedback now, and teachers at St. Andrews do feedback, lot less doing the work for the kids. We force the kids to think more deeply when they get something back. We try to remove the grade as much as possible. We know that paralyzes and creates sometimes a fixed or growth mindset in itself. So those have been two very fertile areas that I've gone after pretty quickly. I think the other one is definitely thinking more broadly about dual coding, and almost every lesson over a period or two will have some level of visual demands on learning, and also sort of the narrative or the auditory demands on learning. I really think coding in our brains, at least in multiple ways, and using multiple modalities is probably something I'm doing exponentially better at today than I certainly was when I first started teaching in 1991.
So you mentioned that not many teachers would be sort of discussing the brain, different parts of the brain in the classroom or whatever. And I'd like to mention at this point that I don't know if you've heard of Joe Bowler with the in the mathematics.
Joe Bowler's work is great.
It's phenomenal. And as a math teacher, I've certainly used her stuff in the classroom, especially at the start of the year. And she talks about the how London taxi drivers, when they learn the knowledge, their hippocampus grows.
Yeah.
And then when they stop being taxi drivers, it actually shrinks again. And, the kids are just like blown away by how the structure of the brain changes as we learn stuff. Should we be talking about the brain more in classrooms? Should we be helping the kids learn about the brain and what's happening as they learn?
One is great shout out for Joe Bowler. I hope she's giving you some money for that. And her stuff's great. I think it's U cubed or something like fantastic. Yeah. I would say the answer to your question is absolutely yes, but we don't have to fear it and we don't have to get carried away with it. So every teacher and student should understand the concept of neuroplasticity, right? And there's a lot of fun ways to demonstrate that. I've seen some very, very creative ways to do that. Certainly when we run our science and teaching in School Leadership Academy, we actually have our teachers dissect sheep's brains. That's our entry point. But when we've presented at schools, we have neuron building kits. And, I think things like myelination is really fascinating because you easily can connect that to, why discussions around memory and work around spacing effect, retrieval practice, and interleaving. I think avoiding the neuromyths that any one learning experience or demand happens in a very isolated part of the brain is really important too. We know both hemispheres of the brain are used in every learning activity, maybe not equally. Uh-huh. We want to break this concept of students saying I'm a right brainer, I'm a left brainer. And I think, if they understand this concept of how the hemispheres sort of dance in some ways, and how the corpus callosum, this sort of super highway of these thick, a bundle of fibers essentially connect the brains, I think that's really, really critical. I want my kids to understand that my goal is to get them to their prefrontal cortex, that high order thinking part of their brain. But the only way I can do that is they need to have a sense of belonging and feeling like their identity is validated, that we've reduced the identity threat, that we're all equal partners in this, recognizing both our explicit and implicit biases that all teachers, regardless of race, gender, class, bring to the learning environment are really critical. So to answer your question, one is I think it's also exciting. Giving kids the idea that they're empowered to rewire their brain. It's not easy. It takes you want to create that what we write in the book. I forget what page it's on, but how do we get kids and even teachers as learners into that zone of proximal discomfort? Where the challenge is achievable, okay, but it's not too easy, right?
Yeah.
We know that matters a lot in terms of engagement and attention. And I think so. To answer your question, I do believe there's a certain level of neuroscience all teachers and school leaders and students should know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there's things like the Dana Foundation's Brain Awareness Week is a fun way to get at that. There's great books out there as well, and certainly, as you mentioned, Joe Bowler's work is fun. Is a fun way to approach it as well.
You've used the word fun now a couple times since we've been talking, and it just reminded me of one of my favorite strategies that you name in the top 12 research-informed strategies that every teacher should be doing. It's actually that last one, which is you say students need frequent opportunities during the school day to play. Yeah. A couple years ago, I read Stuart Brown's book, Play, How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul. And I felt like Neuroteach and Brown's book sort of talked to each other a bit. And I was wondering, how have you incorporated play in your classroom?
Right. I mean, you can call it fun. You could play. And again, I think, in the Washington, D.C., market, right? Using those words, it's you would argue somewhat risky. I mean, parents would say, "Well, I didn't play. I didn't have fun at school."
Right.
And, but pre-collegiate school should not be sort of like that bad medicine and you'll get well when you go to college. I mean, where I think so lower school teachers get it right. I mean, you want fun, play, knowledge transfer through the arts, space practice, repetition. I mean, really, I've not been brave enough to teach in lower school or anything, younger than 6th grade. But when I want some of my best inspiration, I actually go to our lower school. But I'm always curious why the fun and play as students get older, middle school and then upper school, goes away.
Yeah.
Right. And especially when you cross this sort of firewall from 8th to 9th grade, and both students and parents get on the sort of the college admissions, conveyor belt and get crazy, to be honest with you. I'll go on record. I have a 16-year-old daughter. She's a junior in high school. I'd like to think I'm doing it a little better, but I'm sure.
We don't have any of those at Park Tudor.
No. Look, Indianapolis doesn't own that, or neither does Washington D.C. But I think a couple of things. Right, yeah, humor is important in teaching, right? And I think there's a difference between humor and sarcasm, and you got to be careful. You better know your kids really well and have good relationships. But I do know some great teachers use sarcasm appropriately. But humor is important. I mean, play is playing with ideas. And again, I don't. It's not. And I think that's really important. So I often think I've gotten to play and fun through choice, right? Bringing creativity into class now. Is a way we get playful and have a good time. Trying to think about history, which I teach, in ways that might be more creative and sort of entertaining, because we know, we gotta sell the purpose of history to our students. At the same time, when you bring in play and fun, that might put kids in a very comfortable place. It's also going to take some students put them in an uncomfortable place,
right?
Which is good, right? I mean, some students, play, design thinking, recreating the Battle of Gettysburg on a hilltop at St. Andrews, right? That's fun, but it's also very disciplined fun in that we've read Killer Angels, we've studied. The 3 or 4 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. And then we go to the hillside just over the about 500 yards where I'm sitting. And then we recreate Little Round Top. I mean, that's fun, but in a disciplined way. For some kids, that is a stretch of learning that I have to be reminded that creates stress.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes to this idea that in any given week, in any given unit, if a teacher can hit and focus on multiple modality, multiple sensory instruction, every kid will be both stretched and find success in that unit. And I think that's what we should all be striving for and scoring ourselves each week as educators.
So you mentioned this multiple modality, using different techniques, using variety. I know in your book you talk about, you even call it sort of a myth or a fallacy about that there is a type of learner, that learners have particular strengths. And you talk about preferences as opposed to strengths. So can you talk a bit more about that and say kind of where that came from? And that's fairly controversial, perhaps.
Only controversial because most educators still believe in the neuro myth of learning styles, right? So when myself and my co-author for the book, Ian Keller, present, I mean, we have some playful activities, fun activities. I'll keep on that theme today. The learning style question is always out there. I mean, I think all of us intuitively believe, right, that if you teach me visually and assess me visually, that I will attain higher academic achievement than if you teach me in multiple modality instruction.
Uh-huh.
Well, that has never been proven. So let's be clear on that. And it's also been the incorrect way a lot of educators over the last 15 years have misstated Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, which he, we don't. I wish we knew Howard personally, but I certainly know. I've heard him speak, and he's playing like defense, like no, I didn't mean it that way. No, absolutely not. Right. So knowing that we don't have learning styles, right? And which is actually good news for teachers, because if it gets proven, then we have to think about leveraging technology to create individual learning plans, cater to each kid's learning style every day, right? Now, I believe we might get there anyway because of technology, right? But let's set that aside for a second. So what we continue to talk about is when kids talk about having learning styles, we've always worried that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of a fixed mindset. Hey, I learn visually. So if I present something auditorily or kinesthetically, then that kid might just shut him or herself off immediately. So at St. Andrews, we often talk about current. The word current is really important too. What is your current learning strength and current learning challenges? What are your current learning preferences? Because goes back to neuroplasticity. We know what might be a current learning strength or weakness in third grade because of the evolution of the brain and deliberate practice. By 11th grade, that weakness might have become a strength, or that strength, to be honest, might have been pruned away and become a weakness or sort of neutralized because of deliberate practice in other areas. So, again, I think a successful week of school, of teaching for any instructor, is have you hit every modality in your lessons. That is a good research-informed week. And as teachers develop lesson plans or their weekly syllabus, that's what you should be scoring yourself again. Did I hit multiple modalities? Did I hit multiple senses? Be careful on the smell one. I didn't master that one yet. I do know a teacher once sprayed perfume in her classroom thinking that would fire up some neurons, and one kid broke out in a rash. Right. So, but again, that's an achievable challenge. Multiple modality instruction is an achievable challenge for teachers. It should be the goal of every week. And it is measurable, because you can say, look, right now I start generally every one of my classes with kids walk in and they see an image of history. Mm-hmm. And that's their sort of, my brain priming moment. That image will relate to the essential question of the period and the focus of that period. Uh-huh. Sometimes I've used music. My favorite class last year, and the kids still can't figure this out. Literally, they walked in and we were studying the War of 1812, and I just played the whole Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, which never ends. And all of a sudden, that's all. Like, they came in, I played it, for the class time. I didn't even say a word. I had their attention wrapped. That was class. I mean, imagine not speaking during a class. It was awesome.
And that sticks in your head, that tune. They won't forget that in a hurry.
No, because then the assignment that night was okay. One, they could replay it.
Uh-huh.
But how did this piece of music evoke this one of the most famous battles in American history? In world history.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So that was a fun way.
That was Glenn Whitman, co-author of Neuroteach.
Join us next time as we continue talking with Glenn about neuroscience and its implications for teaching and learning.